This chapter is about how courage and contempt for death are fostered in battle. I don't believe in reckless courage. Courage begins where a person's consciousness overcomes fear, and if it doesn't, then... Extraordinary circumstances forced me in March 1942 to go to the 1245th Rifle Regiment, when the day before my assistant in Komsomo work, Pyotr Alexandrovich Repiev, reported what had happened. This can't be. Repiev shrugged his shoulders, averted his eyes and said, "It's bitter to hear, but it's a fact. I have just returned from Ivan Moroz's battalion, and here I am in the regiment. Nikolai Ivanovich Kliniov, an investigator of the prosecutor's office of the division, had already arrived there. I went into the hut where the interrogation was conducted and saw the soldier Semyonov. He was standing in front of the investigator's table without a belt. His head was down, and the fingers of his right hand were stroking the bottom button of his uniform or groping the empty pocket on his chest. I knew Semyonov well. He had recently been in the commandant's platoon of the division headquarters. There he had received news that his younger brother had been killed at the front and demanded to be sent to the front line. And suddenly, such a thing. From the leisurely interrogation of N.I. Klinov Semyonov's answers, the stories of witnesses, the following picture emerged. On the fields and forest edges, there was a dry March snow. During the day it melted and dirty water had to be scooped out of the trenches. Empty tin cans were used to scoop up the sludge all day long, and by evening it was covered with lumpy, crunching ice. This trench fighters took recently, when they broke through the encirclement ring around our 29th Army. The fascists decided to cut the advancing Ural division onto the route and threw us in the flank of 2 infantry regiments and units of the Tank Army from the west, and more than 40 tanks and an infantry regiment rushed to meet them from the southeast. In the early morning of March 20, a barrage of fire fell on the trenches. The soldiers, among whom Ivan Semyonov was among them, sprawled at the bottom of the trenches, pressed against the ribbed muddy ice. Seen ahead roared Junkers and methodically bombed every metre of land, and suddenly squat tanks with white crosses on the armour suddenly appeared. In the pre-morning haze, Ivan Semyonov imagined that they were near. Reach out your hand and feel the armour, but all he had was a rifle. The Nazis were following the tanks. Ivan sees every button on their overcoats, blackened round holes on the muzzles of automatic rifles, eyes squinted maliciously. Now this tank will pile up on the trench, and the automatic rifles will whip a line at him. On Ivan's right, at each close burst, a newcomer's overcoat-clad back shuddered. On the left, covering the back of his head with spread fingers, lay another fighter. Suddenly it seemed to Ivan that there were only 3 of them against 40 tanks. Something broke inside, and Ivan dropped his rifle, jumped out of the trench and rushed to the rear. Following him ran a few more fighters from those who arrived only yesterday, right from the echelon. Chinese at Timosim Surias could not believe his eyes. The Red Army soldiers were running at him, waving his hand to the machine gunners. He jumped towards them. "Stop. Get back." The fleeing immediately collapsed in the snow. "Stand up. Forward. Follow me." Moroz shouted imperiously, and the soldiers, instantly regaining their senses, rushed at the enemy, keeping up with the lieutenant. And then the reserve unit, headed by Grigory Nikolaevich Dunayev, from Chelyabinsk came to the place of the breakthrough. The mortars of Vladimir Georgievich Kirchanin from Kamyshlov put down a hurricane fire on Hitlerites. Guns of gunners. Savovsk citizens Fedor Dmitrovich Predin and Alexei Danilovich Spitsin hit the German tanks at point-blank range, and those raising fountains of snow frozen overnight went at top speed. But here one tank twitched and froze, the second, the third, steel boxes closer and closer. Alexander Chestiakov took up the machine gun, and somewhere near one after another the anti-aircraft gun of the gunner Alexander Lobayev sent shells into the sky. A Junkers caught fire, a Messerschmitt crashed to the ground. Only Ivan Semyonov did not take part in this battle. He did not get up when the soldiers with Lieutenant Moroz rushed to the left trenches. He woke up only when someone threw him to the ground a kilometre from the front line near Konstantin Devyatov's mortar battery. Ivan Semyonov was shaking like in a fever. He had no rifle. His hat was left in the trench. His belt was lost somewhere. "You bastard," said someone and spat. The soldiers rushed to the mortars. The fascists were advancing. That day they managed to break a gap between our and the neighbouring division, and in this gap we threw a fighter anti-tank division. There the battery of Senior Lieutenant Alexander Motorin was fiercely shooting from the attacking fascists. We stopped the enemy, but at a very expensive price. Not a single gun was left in the battery of A. Motorin Alexei Spitsin was killed under the tracks of a tank. The regiment commander Serafim Vladimirovich Chernozerski was mortally wounded, and he died in the medical center. With Regiment Commissar Peter Ivanovich Usashev, Battalion Commander Ivan Nikiforovich Moroz. Yes, we had no arguments to justify Ivan Semenov. Why didn't he turn back when the rest of the fighters rushed to the tanks? Why didn't he come back when the mortars stopped him? He's just a coward. Semyonov stood pale, breathing intermittently. His hands were rising to his face, then literally falling at the seams. Do not destroy, he begged. I'll go back into battle. I have 2 children, and Spitsin Chernozerski. All those who died because of you have no families. Nikolai Ivanovich Klinov exploded. Semyonov lowered his head. Large drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. He was silent for a few minutes while Klinov wrote the protocol, then angrily asked, "Well, Comrade Commissar, so, to the tribunal. It will be decided by the division commander." On the edge of the grove lined up soldiers of the new replenishment. Ivan Semyonov is in front of the line. The chairman of the military tribunal of the division, Grigory Vasilievich Vorobyov, unfolded a folder and in a tired, cold voice began to read. The verdict of the military tribunal Semenov, Ivan Terentyevich is condemned and sent to a punitive company. Grigory Vasilievich sighed and added on his own behalf. And the penalty company is sent to the place where it is most dangerous. If Semyonov distinguishes himself in battle, we'll take off his criminal record. If he's wounded, we'll take it off him too. If he dies, death itself will clear him of his crime before the motherland. If he chickens out, he'll answer according to the law. I looked at Ivan Semyonov and thought about what had happened. It couldn't have just happened out of the blue, and perhaps we are to blame, though indirectly, for his cowardice. Here the division was run in by tanks, and the commandant's platoon was sitting in a dugout and laughing. Yes, we're screwed, guys. In the cold, not here. I knew about it, but I didn't demand to send the platoon and Ivan Semyonov together with him into the trenches, under the tanks, so that they wouldn't be afraid of rumbling and firing. That was the first mistake, and it should be corrected from the fact that those who came with the replenishment should not be sent immediately into battle, but first cured of tank phobia. In front of the hushed soldiers stood dejected Ivan Semyonov and listened to Vorobyov, and it was a hot June day. The sun was blazing, leaves rustled on birch trees. Soldiers were laughing. There was a holiday in the division. For the spring battles, 188 men were awarded orders and medals. Here they are clear, joyful step approached the table and received modest square boxes. And suddenly a familiar face flashed. Is it really Semyonov? Yes, him? So the division commander, Major General Alexander Nikolaevich Sokolov, handed him a box and said, "So congratulations to you, Ivan Terentyevich, with the Order of the Red Star. Act the same way." A month and a half ago, the penalty company was transferred to the area where the Hitlerites were supposed to break through. Together with other soldiers, Ivan Semenov climbed into the trenches and began to wait intensely. Everything was similar to the trench that he occupied in March. Only at the bottom there was no ice and the sun was shining brightly. The first grass had broken through on the barrier. When the German guns struck, Ivan's neighbours did not prostrate themselves on the muddy bottom of the trench, but simply sank down along the wall and clasped their rifles between their knees. Ivan did the same, but the familiar feeling of fear slowly rolled over him. His hands fumbled with the buttons. He unnecessarily felt the bolt, moved the sighting frame. The neighbour on his right outwardly carelessly pulled out a black kitset, lazily tore off a strip of newspaper and began to roll a cigar. But for some reason he rolled it longer than usual, and the matches did not light, but kept flaring up and going out. The neighbour on the left nodded his head at every close burst, and drew a line on the red clay wall of the trench with a twig, and no one covered his head with spread fingers. All waited. The artillery preparation would end, and Hitlerites would come under cover of tanks. It was necessary to meet them with fire. Everyone was waiting. Ivan Semyonov was also waiting, still continuing to feel the bolt of his rifle. Yesterday, when they sneaked to these trenches, Ivan saw a dead Red Army soldier. The funeral team had not yet cleaned up the soldier. Ivan remembered his dead brother. and he imagined that his little brother was lying with his arms stretched out like that, looking at the winter sky with eyes that could no longer see. He also remembered thousands of other dead soldiers who lay on the roadsides of the winter offensive, and it seemed to Ivan that not only his brother, but all these nameless soldiers demanded revenge on the enemy. And the German guns threshed and threshed. Here one shell hit a trench about 20 meters away, and splinters splashed on the wall of their section. But the soldiers next to them just calmly turned their heads and put out their cigarettes. The artillery preparation was suddenly silenced, and Semyonov suddenly got up and looked behind the bumper. There, in the direction of the enemy, there were 15 tanks in rhombus formation. Why 15? Ivan could not answer, but they remained in his memory, camouflaged with white crosses. But now it no longer seemed that they were close by, that you could reach out and get them. And the machine gunners, seen behind the tanks as silhouettes, did not cause the same horror. Once again Ivan remembered the fighter with outstretched arms, his dead brother, and immediately the thought struck them. But I, too, could be killed. Semyonov looked back at his neighbor. He was adjusting a bottle with incendiary mixture, and Ivan suddenly mundanely arranged 3 grenades in front of him. He arranged them and looked ahead, ducked down when a machine gun from the right tank was hitting their trench. The tanks were coming in a rhombus. The head tank was already somewhere on the right, over the trench, and began to dance furiously on the berm, and then rushed forward. But Ivan's, tank was still 20 meters away, and Semyonov took the first grenade, shrieked and threw it. The grenade did not fly, exploded in the young grass, and the tank was coming, spitting fire from the machine gun and cannon. Ivan ducked down, threw a second grenade. It hit the caterpillar, and the tank turned sideways towards the trench. "There's one," Ivan said to himself, suddenly calm. Either he had swept it away, or something else. Another tank was moving towards him from the right, and he had only one rifle again, feeling a new wave of weakness flooding his body. Ivan looked back. His neighbor on the right, who had been twirling a cigarette for a long time before, was lying motionless, clutching a bottle of incendiary mixture in his right hand. The left neighbor was leisurely firing at the German soldiers. Semyonov bent down and rushed along the trench to the right, snatched the bottle from his comrade's numb fingers, wanted to throw it at the tank, but did not have time. The tank on the trench, the ground collapsed from its weight, almost crushing Semyonov. Ivan scraped a grater on the huge match on the bottle and threw it on the engine part of the tank. Semyonov heard the clink of shattering glass and sank to the bottom of the crushed trench. The battle ended at evening dawn. Ours did not retreat, but also did not move forward. But in front of the trenches and behind them stood 9 stationary tanks. 2 of them were hit by him, Ivan Semyonov B. But the main thing was not in these tanks, not in the enemies he killed, but in the fact that he suppressed his inner enemy, his fear, and felt himself part of a huge force that can withstand in any difficult battle. Kit. It lay now under the glass of the display case, a black satin kit set with 2 side pockets for matches and paper. A child's inexperienced hand embroidered with red threads the words, "To the dear defender of the mother," and next to it, a pair of good mittens, unpretentious at first glance things, but how many people and events of the distant war years I see behind them. At the end of April 1942, the division, exhausted in the last battles, fixed on the positions and waited out the thaw. The snow had already melted, but the young grass had not yet had time to sprout. The buds on the trees were just swelling. All of us were waiting for spring, waiting for summer, waiting for something else. In short, there was that wonderful mood when, despite the blood and suffering, you suddenly notice the first blade of grass by the roadside and the blue sky between the low-running clouds. And on such a day the news spread throughout the division. The chiefs from the Urals have arrived. They were not allowed to rest, but dragged straight to the firing positions, to the dugouts and dugouts. They sat them on the driest and warmest places and asked them everything. Now, how was it in Sverdlovsk? And in Tagil? I'd like to hear something about Serov, said Nois. Are there any of you from Krasnofimsk? And near one of the huts stood 2 confused men, who did not look like each other at all, repeating in vain. Father? Son. Father? Son. Nikita Petrovich. Mukamituka. It was an amazing meeting. Nikita Petrovich Badovsky, a toolmaker of the enrichment factory, came from asbest far from the front and met here Mukhamet Akhtamovich Akhmetzianov, his adopted son. And then, wherever Nikita Petrovich went, Mukhamet followed him. And so they saw these 3 short days together all the time. A dense ring surrounded the fighters of the worker of Uralmash in Idanov, a pale face, not thickly fed, it is obvious. Strong, calloused hands with black metal dust forever embedded. Does this man go home from the shop? And Ivanov keeps pulling out of the sack packs of cookies, kissettes, mittens, and says, "This is a buttstock for the Ural tanks and cannons. It's a small thing, but when you take it in your hands, it's as if the sun shines brighter above you and you breathe easier, and through the bloody bustle of battles you feel behind your back those who help you fight, those whom you protect." In the end, the delegates were so tortured that the division commander, General Sokolov, ordered to gather representatives of units and subdivisions. And here on a barely dried meadow near the village of Voskresenskaya lined up the best of the best, heroes from heroes. Nearby, a few kilometers away, shell bursts and machine gun bursts could be heard. The war was going on in its own way, but, drowning out the voice of war, Nikita Petrovich Badovsky read the order of the Urals to his division. Liberate your native land from fascist invaders. Fight harder for our just cause. And we, Uralians, promise you to give more tanks, cannons, and everything else, without which you cannot do without in battle. After Nikita Petrovich, other delegates also spoke. They told how they live, how they work, how they welcome those who came from the lands occupied by the enemy. The time of parting came imperceptibly. The father said goodbye to his adopted son, P.P. Petrova from Tagil said goodbye to her fellow countryman, N.I. Ivanov from Uralmash left for the east. But the main thing remained: the front and the rear are united with this thought, and the soldiers left to meet new battles. At the front, sometimes a small thing will tell the human heart much more than other long and correct articles. For example, a parcel with a pair of socks, a colourful handkerchief, and a neatly folded piece of paper to the best fighter. So it is decided on honour and conscience to whom to give the gift. Or a telecommunicator brings a letter from home, and it goes around the hands, read to death. Everyone makes adjustments for his family, for his neighbours. You see, in a rare lull, people talk not about death, not about battles, but about peaceful affairs, about families and loved ones who stayed in the Urals, about machine tools and cars, about schools and forest plots. And on that spring day I was given a simple kit set and a pair of mittens. I carried them through all the battles, keeping them as a piece of land that gave me strength. And when the war was over, I gave the kit set and mittens to the local museum. Let everyone see them. When I come to this showcase myself, I sometimes think it would be good to meet the one whose weak child hands embroidered this uneven line to the dear defender of the motherland, to bow down and say a soldier's thanks. There is a street in the city of Reserve named after Nikolai Sokolov. The combat path of the 375th Ural Rifle Division is connected with this name. It was here that we lost our commander, General Nikolai Alexandrovich Sokolov, but he remained in the memory of the veterans of the division and in the memory of those who now walk along this street, who live in the houses that have risen from the ruins, who visit Lenin Square in Kalinin, where Sokolov's ashes rest, and his name is carved in gold letters on the marble. A lot of other names and events of that fighting time have remained forever with us, the soldiers who fought near Richev. After the liberation of the town of Steritsa in January of the 42nd, we fought on the Radzev direction. Then we reached Kraptsovo, Goshchino, Irouge, Sobakino. Then we struck a blow to the enemy west of Radzev. We fought to the death here day and night in February. March and April liberated the villages of Bakhmutovo, Klepenino, Timontsevo, Pitalino, Nozhkino, Kokoshkino, Vorobayevo, Varnievo, Usavo, Samoilovo, Ovsyanikovo, Tarutino, Rishitalovo, and many other villages of Rajevsky district. In accordance with the order of the commander of the Kalinin front, General I.S. Konev, in early May our division was withdrawn to the front reserve. After the march it concentrated in the forest of Staretsky district near the villages of Naletkino, Kushnikovo, Klim. There came a break between battles. Here we summarize the winter battles. Commanders, staff officers studied the experience of past battles, and we, political workers, the experience of party political work. The thinning units were replenished, specially distinguished in the battles were awarded. More than 300 orders and medals were awarded. Commanders of units and subdivisions continued to submit to the division headquarters relays for awards. Their number exceeded 1,000. The commander of the regiment of Babchuk wrote, Fredin Fedor Dmitrievich, gunner of the gun, entered the battle with 6 tanks and up to a platoon of enemy infantry, received a wound but did not leave his place, continued the fight. He shot down 2 tanks, received a second wound which turned out to be fatal. The attack was repulsed. September Avtsev wrote, Politruk Dvyatov Konstantin Miranovich, when repelling the enemy counterattack, when the battery commander was wounded, took charge of the battery. Under his command, the battery repelled 3 attacks of the fascists. Up to 100 enemy corpses were left in front of the position. Comrade Devyatov himself killed 4 Hitlerites with a rifle. The attack was repulsed. Komsomolets Pushelnikov, under heavy enemy fire, went out to eliminate the breakage of the communication line. He eliminated 5 breaks. He was seriously wounded, but continued to work. He eliminated 3 more breaks. An enemy bullet killed the brave communicator, but the connection continued to work. Pushelnikov was found holding the ends of the wire in his teeth. Ivan Petrovich Sergeyev, a Red Army soldier, member of the All-Union Communist Party, during hand-to-hand combat eliminated more than 10 fascists. He replaced the platoon commander, who was out of action, led the platoon forward, occupied the enemy trench. It is impossible to list the names of all the heroes. Communists, Komsomol members were true leaders of the masses. Their personal example and heroism attracted soldiers to the feat. We rested from fighting, persistently improved military skills, increased the combat effectiveness of units and subdivisions, persistently, patiently trained new recruits. After almost 3 months in the reserve in early August, we were ordered to rejoin the 30th Army. And here we are in a new area, in the forest south of the village of Myashino. The Military Council of the Army, knowing the 375th Ural Division from the past battles, decided to put it into battle in the direction of the main blow of the army. Our division began to concentrate for the attack on Rozhov in the area of Dubrovka, Korshnovo, Polunino. Day and night there were heavy rains. The roads became impassable. In addition, it was necessary to overcome the open swampy terrain between the tract of Kryukovo and the settlements of Deshevka, Dubrovka. No mode of transportation could overcome the impassable roads. Horses sank in the mud up to their bellies. Artillery stuck. Enemy planes, choosing the time when visibility improved, appeared over the area and bombed the accumulation of our troops. Long-range artillery of the fascists hit here too. But people did not count for anything. In the knee-deep mud they rolled guns with their hands, carried mortars. On their shoulders they carried shells, mines, ammunition, food, in short, everything that was required for the battle. Were gathered in the dugout of the division commander. Chief of Staff Colonel P.D. Gavurenenko reported the combat order for the offensives. Our division, with the 143rd Tank Brigade, acting in the main direction of the army strike, breaks through the enemy defences in the area between Galikov and Zyritsov, seizes the Mark 195.9, the railroad Arzhev-Torshok, near Grybiv. Further advances on Apoki Rachev. The division's offensive is supported by the 1098th Cannon Artillery Regiment and the 281st Guards Mortar Division. To our right comes 52nd, left to 274th Infantry Division. In the second echelon of the army is coming 2nd Guards Rifle Division, ready to develop success at the junction of our and 274th Divisions. General Sokolov, listening to his Chief of Staff, looked at the map, tried to clearly visualize the coming battle, but the deeper the general assessed the situation, the more anxious he became in his heart. Little artillery and shells, the terrain is swampy, tanks will not pass, the ways of transportation is poor. Sokolov had never been to Rzhev, but he knew that it was an ancient Russian city on the Volga with a well-developed industry and a population of 50,000 people. And now Rzhev was turned by the enemy into a major resistance node, which must be seized. Sokolov was looking for a weak spot in the enemy defense. Before the offensive was done a lot of painstaking work. Staff officers prepared documentation, mapped the direction of strikes of units and subdivisions, made schemes, tables of artillery fire, calculations of ammunition, plans for material support of units. Scouts studied in detail the peculiarities of the enemy's defense. All this work was led by the Chief of Staff of the Division P.D. Gavurenko. Gavurenko was one of those staff workers who can not only write papers. He was a man of thought, a wide outlook, After graduating from the Academy of Armored Forces, began the War Commissar of the Tank Division. In early March 1942, he became Chief of Staff of the Ural Division. The morning of August 10, thick black clouds went behind the horizon. A fresh wind was blowing over the fields. General Sokolov at his observation post on a small height not far from the front line. Tanks of the 143rd Brigade were pulling up to the line intended for deploying the attack. At 5:45, the artillery preparation began, but it was not as planned and expected by the infantry prepared for the attack. The density of fire was low, although the artillery preparation lasted about an hour. And then a red rocket soared into the sky. The attack began. Tanks and infantry rushed forward to Redshev. Clouds of dust and smoke covered the sky and the battlefield. Attackers broke into the first line of trenches of the enemy, came to the second. The enemy, by repeated counterattacks, supported by tanks and aircraft, tried to stop our offensive. And then disaster struck. Swamp and minefield stopped our tanks. They lagged behind the infantry, began to support the infantry with fire from the place. But enemy bombers came and started bombing. Tanks were forced to retreat to their original positions. The whole weight of the battle fell on the infantry. The battle was already deep in the enemy defences. At this time, the regiment commander, Major Razratnikov, found a group of enemy prepared for a counterattack. There was a command to battalions, artillerymen, to destroy the enemy. The infantry lay down. The politruk of the 2nd Machine Gun Company of the regiment Belenki, under the hurricane fire of the enemy, rolled forward the machine gun and began to shoot Hitlerites at point-blank range. The battalion, led by the commander, Senior Lieutenant Sitnikov, engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Germans could not withstand the bayonet blow, rolled back. On the shoulders of the retreating soldiers broke into the enemy trenches. The right flank company, commanded by Komsomol Lieutenant Arkady Gavrilovich Falenda, was surrounded by fascists. Then the commissar of the battalion, political instructor Pyotr Alexeyevich Orlov, raised another rifle company in attack. The soldiers rushed after their commissar. The enemy ring was broken. Soon artillerymen and mortarmen came to the aid of rifle units. Spirin shot accurately from a mortar. He alone continued to fire when almost the whole calculation was out of action. Red Army man Timirzian Komatkarov hit enemy tanks with an anti-tank gun. Junior Sergeant Komutov sent mine after mine at counter-attacking Germans from 120mm mortar. In the second half of the day, new parts of the enemy entered the battle, and Hitlerites in some areas managed to stop our advance. Tense battle by the evening quieted down. It was decided to prepare a new attack during the night. In the darkness, pushing boxes with explosives in front of them, a group of sappers was crawling to the railroad embankment at Gribiv. In front crawled Communist Sergeant Smertin, followed by Red Army Myasnikov, Krasnov, Turchenkov, Vinogradov. Soon they approached the minefield, covering the railroad bed. Smertin and Myasnikov quickly made a narrow passage and laid a large charge of TNT, carefully inserting the fuse. They tied a long cord of telephone wire to the check and began to crawl back. But at that time, Hitlerites appeared and opened fire on the sappers. There was no time to think about caution. Red Army soldier Myasnikov tore the cord. A strong explosion shook the ground. Flames went up. Together with the ground, sleepers, rails, fascist soldiers flew up into the air. Half an hour before the explosion, the second group of sappers under the command of Komsomol Senior Lieutenant Moiseev finished demining the minefield. Deputy Political Officer Kuzmin, fighters Yeroshko, Bondarchuk, Department Commander Sergeant Lykov and Ajiv acted bravely. During the night they extracted more than 400 mines, made passages for tanks and infantry. The explosion on the canvas served as a signal for the attack. Our tanks and infantry rushed forward. Battalion Captain Nikolaev captured the embankment of the railroad, destroyed 5 bunkers and several dugouts, surrounded up to a company of machine gunners and almost completely exterminated them. Captain Alexey Vasilievich Nikolaev was wounded twice in this battle, but did not leave the battlefield. The battalion was counterattacked 8 times during the day, but all enemy counterattacks were repulsed. When the calculation of the machine gun was out of service, and in the heat of battle there was no one to replace it, Combat Nikolaev himself laid down for the machine gun. In the afternoon of August 11, the Germans attacked the positions of the 1,243rd Rifle Regiment. Several enemy tanks broke through the fighting order and approached the observation post of the regiment commander, Major Zratnikov. Everyone who was here joined the battle with the tanks. 2 cars were hit. Enemy machine gunners who broke through behind the tanks were completely destroyed, but we also suffered considerable losses. Alexei Spiridonovich Ratnikov, the commander of the stake, fell to the death of the brave. The commissar of the regiment, Polikarp Petrovich Khabarov, was wounded. The regiment was led again in the attack by Captain Alexei Nikolaev. The fascists paid a dear price for the death of the heroes of the Urals, leaving 6 tanks and more than 300 corpses on the battlefield. They rolled back. From behind the left wing of the 1,243rd Infantry Regiment, the 1,245th Regiment under the command of Major Ivan Alexandrovich Devashchenko and Battalion Commissar Pyotr Ivanovich Usashev, the 2nd Echelon of the division, deployed. He defeated the Germans in the area of Gribevo and completely seized the village. Although in Gribevo, from 33 houses, there was not a single one left. Everything was swept away by fire. The Germans did not want to lose a favorable line for them and went into a counterattack. Kaigorodov's battalion repulsed 3 enemy counterattacks. The soldiers withstood the onslaught, but in this battle the communist Konstantin Afanasyevich Kaigorodov and many soldiers of the battalion were killed. By the evening of August 14, the division units engaged in battle at the edge of a grove northeast of Razev. The enemy met us with heavy fire from bunkers. In front of us were selected German units. As now I see a smokestack on the table. It throws reddish light on the walls of the dugout. It was taken from the enemy in the afternoon, when we were going to the railroad Rzhev-Torzhok. At the map, company commanders. They have not yet cooled down from the battle, and ahead, a new one. In the center, E.V.J. Vedanikov, a young political officer, so the way he characterizes the strengths and weaknesses of enemy defenses, calls the points of possible counterattacks. We can conclude. This man has a comprehensive knowledge of the situation. He has been at the front since August 1941. August 13, 1942, Vedanikov, the commissar of the battalion, took the place of the out-of-service commander and now prepared the battalion for the offensive. Having given the combat order to the company commanders, he gathered the communists and Komsomol members, consulted with them on how best to fulfill the combat task. Signal. The battalion moved in the dark. The sappers sent forward cleared the way from mines all night long. The enemy's fortifications were about 150 meters away when the fascists launched flares and opened rifle and machine gun fire. Our prearranged machine guns, mortars and guns poured fire on the enemy. Lieutenant Laptev's platoon rose up, rushed into the enemy location and began to shoot at point-blank rank range the enemy machine guns. Barnovalov's rifle company penetrated into the forest and destroyed 2 bunkers. The fight on the edge of the forest did not last long. 4 bunkers and dozens of enemy firing points, located on the front line of defense, went up in the air. The soldiers of the battalion went deeper into the forest. With a group of fighters, Vedanikov ran from tree to tree and then noticed that the machine gun that was gouging from the enemy bunker on the opposite side of the clearing forced our rifle company to lie down. The Politruk and his group quickly reached the bunker. Grenades flew, the machine gun was silenced. But almost immediately another German machine gun opened fire from somewhere on the right. The infantry lay down again, then Vedanikov ordered his contact Red Army soldier D.A. Prytkov to destroy this firing point. Daniel Prytkov managed to crawl to the breach at a close distance, and he shot the machine gun crew. But then a dozen Hitlerites surrounded Prytkov. Daniel Alexievich decided to give his life dearly. He destroyed 5 fascists by fire from a machine gun and 3 grenades, and having taken hand-to-hand fight, stabbed 2 more. The soldiers of the platoon who came to Prytkov's aid killed the rest. Later, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for the battles near Razev. The breakthrough of the German defense north of Rakshev, the output of the 30th Army strike forces to the outskirts of the city from the northeast, and the fierce fighting of the 31st Army of the Kalinin Front and the 20th Army of the Western Front in the area of Pogorely-Gorodish created a real opportunity to strike in the flank and rear of the enemy, grouping east of Razev, in particular on its troops occupying a bridgehead on the left bank of the Volga. Troops of the Western Front, breaking through the defense of the German 9th Army, came to the railroad Rzhev, Vyazma, and covered the Arzhev grouping of the enemy from the south. The enemy made every effort to keep the whole area of Rzeów behind itself, to prevent the breakthrough of the 30th Army units into the city. Hitler's command decided to withdraw its troops from the left to the right bank of the Volga, to reduce the defense front, to throw the released troops to strengthen the defense of the city from the northeast. But even this did not help. The fascist command was forced to hastily transfer fresh divisions to Rzeów, intended for the development of the offensive in the Stalingrad and Caucasus directions. Thus we drew some of the enemy forces, thus helping the Stalingraders. The enemy resisted fiercely. There was no account of his counterattacks. But the regiments of our division moved forward and in the morning of August 16 approached Rzeów. Separate units broke into the military town, captured several barracks. But they could not advance further. The enemy turned every stone house, every barracks into a fortress. In the basements and lower floors were placed mortars and guns for direct fire on the roofs and towers. Everything around was mined and surrounded by wire fences in 3 or 4 rows. All firing points, buildings adapted to the defense, were connected with each other trenches full profile. Fighting in the area of the military camp took a protracted character. It was impossible to get to the bunkers and buildings covert. The shrubbery ended 400 meters before the enemy positions. Further, there was an open meadow, every meter of which was shot through. Still, the infantry had to move forward, bypass the wire fence and hit the enemy from the flank. A group of soldiers led by Junior Lieutenant Prokor Yakovlevich Kovashnin, a former worker from Neviansk, began to short runs across the open terrain. The first to run was Kovashnin. When the junior lieutenant reached the intended boundary, he saw only 4 soldiers near him: Baranov, Gilev, Osnovin, and Ivanov. The rest were pinned to the ground by enemy machine gun fire. What to do? The fighters near Kashnin were among the bravest. He saw in yesterday's battle how they fought. When the squad commander dropped out, Vasily Baranov took command and the squad, blocking the enemy bunker, destroyed it. Today Baranov was assigned as squad commander. He lay not far from Kevshnin and fired a handheld machine gun. Baranov's camouflage coat was covered in blood. Is he badly wounded? Vasily asked the commander. No, not badly. You can fight. Kevshnin himself was wounded. The wound was burning. But there was no time to think about it now. It was necessary to save his comrades, the battalion, which was under the hurricane fire of the enemy. Osnovin's head was also bandaged. Blood seeped through the bandage and ran down to his eyes. He often wiped it off his face, swearing, as if the blood was to blame for preventing him from firing at the fascists. Ivanov and Gilev were wounded, but they, like Kevshnin, Baranov, and Osnovin, paid no attention to their wounds and continued to shoot at the enemy. When Kevshin looked back at the battalion lying under enemy fire, he noticed that several more men were crawling up to his group. He recognized one of them at once. It was the orderly Bitev, who decided to get to the group of brave men and dress their wounds. In courage, he was not inferior to anyone. Now next to Kevshin, 8 men were firing at the fascists. They tried to divert the enemy's attention to themselves, to give the battalion an opportunity to entrench and achieve their goal. The battalion, commanded by Grigory Ivanovich Pokotayev, gained a foothold. From these positions, the regiment attacked the fascists, broke into the military town, liberated several barracks, captured an ammunition depot and 24 vehicles. Sakhinel Govorinenko called to himself Scouts Senior Lieutenant Makarov and Deputy Political Officer A. Rogozin and ordered to get the language. For 2 days the scouts observed the enemy, studied his front line, determined where to make passes in the wire fence and in the minefield. In the dark September night they went out on a combat operation. One could not see a sign around. From time to time came the rumble of bursting mines and the crackle of machine guns. Carefully looking into the darkness of the overcast night, the scouts went forward. On the way, an open clearing with sparse bushes. From time to time the enemy fired at it from machine guns. They crawled through the clearing in a crawl. We had no sooner moved 10 steps away from the bushes, as Rogozin threw himself on the ground. Fighters Kritanin and Meshkov instantly bumped their faces into the dry, prickly grass. The bright yellow light of the rocket illuminated everything around. The warriors lurked, trying to do nothing, not even breathing, not to give themselves away. The rocket went out. Darkness again. The scouts moved on, cautiously past the minefield, groping with their hands-pegs placed by sappers. Tracer bullets flew over the scouts' heads. It became more and more difficult to get to the intended place. Here was the enemy's defense line. Trenches with machine gun crews, a German dugout. Here and was to take the tongue. The scouts listened to the conversation in the dugout. Suddenly the door opened. It became audible how someone in the dugout spoke harshly and angrily, began to swear. Hitlerites hurriedly came out of the dugout and along the trench headed to the rear. Rogozin's hand reached for his belt, where hung several anti-tank grenades and a dagger. As if guessing his thoughts, the scout Novikov whispered, "We've been discovered. Let's use grenades." "We can't. We'll wait," Rogozin replied. The experience of the scout told him that the Nazis came out of the dugout not on alarm. But what to do? If they leave, all plans for nothing. Maybe Novikov is right. We should throw grenades and withdraw. What about the language? There's no way the fascists left the dugout unguarded. So, a little patience. The slightest carelessness, haste, could ruin the scouts. Hitler's voices became distant. Rogozin crawled closer and listened. There was as if a rat was scrabbling in the flour chest. "It's a kraut cleaning the kettle," Rogozin guessed. "It is impossible to delay," signaled Novikov. "Jump." A strong blow with a buttstock. The Hitler fell down. Rogozin stuffed a gag in his mouth and Kretinin, who came up, tied his hands. Rogozin took the Nazi on himself. Everything seemed to be going well, but when they were sneaking through the minefield in the turmoil, they stopped watching the prisoner. He came to his senses, spat out the gag and shouted. The Nazis heard. One after another, several rockets flew into the sky. Machine guns struck. Rogozin signaled, "Support with fire." Our guns, mortars and machine guns started to work. Mainly at dawn, the scouts returned to the regiment. 2 were wounded. The prisoner was also badly wounded. He only the next day regained consciousness and gave valuable testimony. This was the 10th tongue taken by Anatoly Rogozin, and the first one he took at the end of January 1942. On the instructions of the army commander, the division commander regrouped the forces. Part of the battalion was to restrain the enemy from the military town, and the main forces to storm the eastern quarters of Reliev. General Sokolov specified on-the-ground tasks to regiments, organized interaction, and personally checked their readiness for the offensive. After artillery preparation, part of the division went on the attack. A fierce battle ensued. Simultaneously went into attack neighbors on the right and left. The regiment, commanded by Captain Ivan Trofimovich Selenkovich, knocked the enemy out of several houses and broke into the trenches running along the eastern edge of the city, then seized the whole quarter. Further movement of the regiment was halted by the flank fire of guns and machine guns from neighboring blocks. Major Frolov's regiment attacked the enemy to the left of Selenkovich's regiment and, having advanced 300–400 meters, also came under heavy flank fire. At the same time, the enemy poured artillery and mortar fire on the regiment's fighting order. Our infantry, having suffered significant losses, entrenched in the enemy trenches east of the city. The enemy, having pulled up several battalions in the division's line of action, launched more than one counterattack during the day, trying to regain the lost positions. The battle lasted until night, but the enemy's attempts to regain the lost position were not successful. Some peculiarities of the enemy's defense were revealed. The enemy chose strong buildings and left strong garrisons in them. All small and unstable houses were defended in small groups. On the first and second floors of the houses stood machine guns. Enemy snipers from attics and roofs covered the approaches with fire. Street battles in Reliev showed that the best success in the fight against the enemy are not large units, and a small number of well-matched assault groups. Taking this into account, the division commander General Sokolov ordered to create assault groups in rifle regiments and battalions with sappers and single guns for direct fire. Several assault groups were organized in regiments. Each group included machine gunners, sappers with a supply of explosives, guns, anti-tank rifles, and backpack flamethrowers. All regimental artillery, guns of the separate anti-tank fighter division, were used for direct fire. In October 1942, the division resumed the offensive. Storming house after house, moved forward. For several days of the war, the division cleared 4 quarters of Reliev. The resistance of the enemy was increasing. To reinforce their units operating in the offensive zone of the 30th Army, the enemy pulled up fresh forces. Cunning methods were used. In the 32nd quarter, in the windows of one of the buildings appeared female figures. Our fighters immediately stopped firing, nor did the enemy fire. As soon as the Red Army soldiers approached the building, grenades fell on them, but we were not left in debt. The house was destroyed by the fire of an anti-tank gun. In the ruins, our soldiers found 6 corpses of fascist soldiers in women's clothes. Dark night. The assault detachment of Lieutenant Leonti Dmitrievich Moskalenko advanced by feel. The brick wall served as the only reference point. The lieutenant crawled first, listening warily. The detachment during the whole day could not seize the brick house, where Hitlerites were settled. From the windows and embrasures made in the walls, fascists were pouring strong machine gun fire on the assault group. Moskalenko's men twice tried to crawl up to the house, but to no avail. The continuous deadly fire pressed the squad to the ground. Then the lieutenant decided to deceive the fascists. Leaving a few soldiers against the brick house and ordering them to distracting fire at the windows and embrasures, Moskalenko led the main group to the back of the house. The soldiers silently crawled across the street, skipped the enemy trench, and got to the other side of the low brick fence. Muffled footsteps and inarticulate talking were heard. A fascist patrol had passed very close by. The fighters lay at the fence, holding their breath. Moskalenko confidently led the fighters to the part of the yard where wood, piles of broken bricks, and all sorts of junk were lying. This junk could hide from the eyes of the enemy and protect from bullets. Of the group crawled up to the house. In the wall of the building, the lieutenant felt a large hole. He listened. The house was quiet. A communist, Akhmet Gariev, crawled up to the lieutenant and whispered, "I'll go first." The lieutenant shook his hand, and Akhmet Gariev disappeared into the breach. A few minutes later, he was followed by Moskalenko, then Saikev, Volobyov, and 4 more fighters. The rest lurked in the courtyard. Akhmet Gariev cautiously opened the door to the room from where the machine gun was firing and turned on his pocket flashlight. Along the brick wall lay Hitlerites and, apparently, were resting. Only the machine gunner, who was stationed at the window, was firing at a target not visible to Akhmet Gariev. One after another, grenades flew. Immediately at the other end of the house exploded grenades thrown by the lieutenant. The blow was unexpected and quick. In the pitch darkness, they fought hand to hand. The Nazis resisted desperately. And when in the pre-dawn twilight a large group of the enemy tried to break through to help their own, it was met by a barrage of automatic riflemen who remained in the courtyard. The fascist reinforcements did not get through. The assault detachment of Lieutenant Moskalenko gained a foothold. The lieutenant was seriously wounded in this fight. After the counterattack, Hitlerites withdrew. Among the destroyed walls, remains of stoves and pipes, there were several dozens of killed Hitlerite soldiers. One of them was lying on the open flat place of the neutral zone, but closer to our positions. The sounds of battle had not died down yet, as the enemy soldiers began to crawl up to the corpse. Sniper IG Neymershin took cover behind the ruins of the building and calmly destroyed everyone who tried to get close to the dead man. However, the persistence with which the Hitlerites repeated their attempts interested our scouts. They decided to bring the corpse to their side. And how to do it? The fascists shot all the approaches. One of the scouts crawled to the dead, but was wounded and returned. Then, taking the end of the telephone cable in his hand, crawled 18-year-old scout PG Kretinen. He managed under a hail of bullets to get close to the killed fascist and firmly tie the cable to his leg. Then he crawled to a safe place and stretched the cable. Sergeant Belav helped Kretinin. The fascists opened heavy fire but were too late. The scouts were already behind cover. Having examined the killed, they found important schemes, revealing the system of enemy defenses in the military town. For courage, bravery, and bravery Red Army, soldier Peter Grigorievich Kretinin was awarded the Medal for Bravery. In these offensive battles, it was not possible to fully liberate the city of Razev. More than 24 hours, not ceasing even for an hour. It rained mixed with snow. Only in the evening the bad weather subsided, but by night the field was covered with darkness, as if clouds had settled on the ground. Everything was drowned in it. Then thick pre-dawn fog settled with fine drizzle on faces, on overcoats, on rain-soaked coats. Drops of water fell from the bare trees. Underfoot the snow mush and sticky black soil crunched. 600 and more kilometers, from Elets to Orl and from Orel to Belgorod without tiring, day and night. A month of spring mud went the division to help the units, which, holding back large tank forces of the enemy, were withdrawing from Kharkov to the northern Donetsk. To Belgorod, the transitions were swift and the breaks were short. And yet, no matter how difficult it was, the mood was cheerful, upliftive. We were going forward to Kursk, Oboyan and numerous villages were left behind. Forests alternated with clear fields. Colonel Govorinenko abruptly stopped his horse, threw a clipboard from under his cloak on the horse's withers, and, illuminating it with a pocket flashlight, took out a map. These bushy heights are very advantageous for defense. We just need to get ahead of the enemy. To give the enemy these heights and the adjacent slopes means to give him the main Oboyansk highway and the railroad to open the way on which he will rush to Kursk. Govorinenko touched the reins. We had to hurry. The regiments of the division had to occupy the defense line before dawn, specified by the commander of the 21st Army of the Voronezh Front, General Imchistyakov. Our division joined this army on February 17, 1943. The hasty transfer of the 21st Army from the Central Front in the direction of Belgorod was due to the deteriorating situation of the troops of the Voronezh Front, engaged in heavy fighting near Kharkov. At this time, the 21st Army had just begun to unload near the city of Yelts. After mustering Kharkov, Hitler's command moved large tank formations to Belgorod direction. At the same time, it was preparing a blow to our troops south of Oral. The enemy hoped to encircle and destroy west of Kursk a large grouping of Soviet troops. The Supreme Command decided to urgently transfer the 1st Tank, 21st and 64th Armies to the Voronezh Front to eliminate the danger hanging over the troops of the Voronezh and Central Fronts. The 21st Army was ordered no later than March 13th to intercept the main highway south of Kursk and begin an accelerated movement towards Oboyan Belgorod. From that moment, the 21st Army became part of the Voronezh Front. And now our division forced march was on the rapprochement with the enemy, seeking to expand the offensive front. The commander went at a big trot, afraid to splatter it flying out from under the hooves of horses' mud. A little at a distance galloped behind him orderly Misha Goncharenko, horse driver Kosyrev and a few scouts. After Oboyan, the division turned off the highway and took country roads between Lipovy and northern Donetsk. Spring had entered its rights. The ground had thawed. In the lowlands there was impenetrable mud. Artillery sleds, wagons with ammunition got stuck to the gun. Every now and then commands were heard. The soldiers, clinging to the guns and wagons, pushing with all their bodies, pulled them out of the moss. People's voices were overlapped by the noise of the engines of the vehicles that had been halted. In the column of artillery stopped Zis-5 with a gun on the trailer, blocked the road. The colonel listened to the abrupt interruptions of the engine, drove up to the car. There were several people swarming there. "What happened?" he asked the driver. "I don't understand. The engine is malfunctioning, Comrade Colonel." Govorinenko got off his horse. "Let's see what's wrong with the old lady." A flashlight flashed. The cabin door slammed several times. "It's all right. We can go." Thank you, Comrade Colonel." Misha Goncharenko leaned over to Kosyrev, whispered. "He's a tank man. He graduated from the Academy of Armored Troops. He detects engine malfunctions by ear. He often helps his driver, Sergeant Sizov." "Why does the colonel command the infantry and not the tankers?" Kosyrev asked. "You'll know too much. You'll soon grow old." Misha evaded a direct answer. He himself did not know why in March 1942 Govorinenko arrived in the Rifle Division, although at first he was commissar of the tank. Govorinenko caught up with the column of the 2nd Rifle Battalion of the 1243rd Rifle Regiment at the turn of the road to Wisloyo. People were walking in silence. In the thin fog, bayonets were just visible above the soldiers' heads, and in some places anti-tank guns lying on their shoulders. On their backs, slouching from the weight, the pipes of company mortars and the rollers of machine guns swayed in time with their step. The colonel began to cautiously overtake the column. On the side of the road jumped out a man in a trench coat and went to meet the riders. "Comrade Colonel, the battalion passed the 3rd line on time. There are no losses and laggards," reported the battalion commander, Captain Pokotayev. "Is the task of the battalion clear to you?" asked the colonel, getting off his horse and stretching his stiff legs. "Clear, Comrade Colonel." The division commander took Pokotayev aside. "Listen, Pokotayev," he said, "it is necessary to speed up the movement of the battalion as much as possible and to ride the highway before dawn." It turned out that in the evening of March 18, parts of the 69th Army left Belgorod. It was possible that at dawn the enemy would move on Oboyan. At the site of the battalion, Pokotayev also had to take the defense of the Army Fighter Anti-Tank Artillery Division and Art Division of the 932nd Artillery Regiment of Captain Belas. Established communication with the artilleryman, ordered the commander to the commander, hold the highway at any cost. The highway defense is entrusted to our division. There is to hold the highway, replied Pokotayev. The colonel shook hands with the captain and wished him success. I hope for you, he said goodbye. The commander believed this commander as himself. Decisive, proactive in any situation, is not confused, will find the right way out. Not by chance. Pokotayev, having started his service in September 1941 as a platoon commander, already in the battles near Rozhev, led a rifle battalion in the attack. Coming up to the unit of Senior Lieutenant Volkov, Govoronenko noticed a man somehow particularly fast-paced on the sour path. The commander recognized him as the company's party commander, Pyotr. Now, how are you, namesake? We are marching, Comrade Colonel. Pyotrov's voice was unexpectedly cheerful. This pleased the colonel, and he remembered the recent exploits of this man. The battle then arose suddenly. Rifle company came out of the grove and barely reached the crest of an unnamed height, as from the opposite slopes of the Nazis opened fire on it. Soon the tanks with the troopers showed up, turning around on a wide field. They went straight at the company, now and then shrouded in dark grey smoke of gunshots. The paratroopers scattered across the field, ran forward under cover of the tanks. An enemy bullet killed the first number of the machine gun crew. Pyotr lay down behind the machine gun and began to shoot Hitlerites almost at point-blank range. But the enemy kept on pressing. Here a scarlet trickle of blood ran down the sergeant's temple, pouring down the collar of his uniform, suddenly very close by I heard. Russ, surrender kaput. In response, Pyotr threw several grenades and again opened fire from the machine gun. Killed the commander. Peter Pyotr takes command. The fight continues for several hours. At dusk, he raised in a counterattack the remnants of the company and cleared the height of the Germans. The colonel looked respectfully at the parter. Yes, Pyotr Stinovich, it is necessary to step. Perhaps in the morning again have to meet the end. At one of the breaks gathered a group of talking soldiers. One of them received a letter from home. What are they writing about if it's not a secret? I asked. There is no secret, Comrade Chief. My wife writes that many workers at Uralmash, where she works, have applied to join some volunteer unit. At the plant they are now working day and night to make tanks for the new unit. Great. Another soldier put in, the Uralians on their tanks. I wish they were here. Yes, it would be good. Ural infantry and tanks together. BEI supported the soldier. If we move forward like this, the volunteers will arrive at the front only by the time of the hat trick, said a fighter sitting not far from me. I had to correct him. The enemy is still strong, and it's a long way to the end, so the Ural volunteers will have time to meet the fascists. The command form up, interrupted our conversation. Later we learned that in the Urals began the formation of the 30th Ural Volunteer Mechanized Corps, at the front renamed the 30th Tank Corps. In the battles it became the 10th Guards Tank. Light steam was coming from wet overcoats and coats. Gun belts and straps of duffel bags cut shoulders. Even the gas mask, which at first seemed light, now felt like a stone pulling it down. I wanted to lie down on the wet snow and lie without moving. A break. Comes a command. Let's have a little rest, said Ivan Kazemtsov, and, having chosen a drier hillock, sat down. Now he felt even more strongly how his legs were buzzing with fatigue. His shoulder rubbed with the belt of the hand machine gun. After a little silence, he added, What a march. They didn't seem to be in such a hurry to get to Moscow. It's nothing, Ivan Vasilievich. I wouldn't mind making such marches more often. We'd sooner be in Berlin. Red Army man Vasiliev, the second number of the machine gun, smiled tiredly. He's so quick. No, brother, it's still a long way to Berlin. We'll get there anyway. We'll walk around Marx Engels Square. Where did that square come from? We'll defeat the fascists and the square will appear. And he laughed. I've already learned to ask in German how to get to Marx Engels Square. Don't bullshit, Petya. Honestly, Ivan Vasilievich. Please, we can't man zu Marx Engels Platz. Well done. Nukazantsev praised him, though he understood nothing except the words Marx Engels. Me, can you talk to the girl? It is also possible, but I have a girl in Sverdlovsk, so don't let the Germans count on me. All this is good, Kazantsev said in a serious tone, but the commander said that the Germans are in Belgorod. Immediately the smiles disappeared from the faces of the soldiers. It became quiet. So the bastards are crawling again? Soon the second front will open, interrupted the pause young fighter Seltenov. Then they will not know which way to turn. Obligatory, supported Vasiliev with a grin. Maybe even today, if the platoon commander The tired faces of many reflected a smile. The soldiers' second front called the American canned food, which were now lying in duffel bags as an emergency supply. Platoon commanders to company commanders. EA command was heard. Lieutenant Gusev instantly jumped up, ran forward. Returning, announced that the battalion was ordered to take the defense. Dig trenches, strictly observe camouflage. Breakfast will be delivered to the front line, commanded Andrei Gusev. So much for a day's rest. No care about the soldiers, someone grumbled. Why digging in? We'll be moving forward soon. Another voice supported him. Hey, what are you muttering there? Kazantsev interrupted them unhappily. Care? You haven't smelled gunpowder yet? That's why you don't know what's what. The commander says to entrench because he feels sorry for your own head, which Hitler has not yet removed. The units moved to their assigned lines. In the hands of the soldiers appeared shovels, and along the entire front from the farm Yerek to the village of Chernaya Polyana, north of Belgorod, fresh, mixed with snow, wet earth began to glisten. On the heights not far from the Oboyansk highway, the division commander appeared, riding on horseback from the right flank. Well, how on the left? He asked. Regiment came to the specified line. I reported and said about my concern for the fate of the inhabitants of Chernaya Polyana and Shopio. If we take the battle here, the fascists will not spare these villages. There will be vain sacrifices. So I feel sorry for the children and women. Something must be done. Maybe we should notify the villagers about the upcoming battle? Yes, we should think about it. Pyotr Dmitrievich agreed with me. There was still silence when Govoronenko and I were driving along the front. The fog was beginning to clear, and the first rays of the sun were breaking through the gaps in the clouds. Spring was awakening. From the crest of the height down in the valley, we could see long rows of white huts on both banks of the Lipovy Donets, hiding in the valley or running up to the hills. From the very top of the heights we could see Belgorod, where the enemy now lurked. To the left of the railroad Belgorod, Kursk village Chernaya Polyana, our left flank to the right of the village. Behind the grove, in a deep haze, we could see the domes of Belgorod churches. On the other side of the northern Donets from south to north stretched the old town. According to the intelligence, the fascists were there, and that made the old town seem black, cold, and alien. Hardly had the regiments reached their areas, and the soldiers had time to dig trenches, from which they could only shoot lying down. The reconnaissance sent forward report. The movement of the Germans in the area of Belgorod was noticed. Commands were heard at the battalion positions. Disguise the trenches, prepare for battle. The frozen ground at the bottom of the damp trenches made the soldiers, hot from work. Fascists, heard the voice of the observer. Do not shoot. The soldiers passed the commander's order to each other. Let them get closer, fire on the signal. On the hill, at the edge of the forest, where Lieutenant Gusev's platoon held the defense, everything froze. The silence was interrupted only by the clicking of the bolts of rifles and machine guns. Soon this sound died out as well. The soldiers did not give away their presence. The silence pressed with anxious expectation. Even the lark, which high above the heads of the soldiers had just sung its cheerful song, suddenly fell silent, as if also prepared with the soldiers for mortal combat. Lieutenant Gusev was lying next to Kazantsev and, putting field binoculars to his eyes, watched the approaching Nazis. Kazantsev envied the coolness of his commander, though he considered himself an experienced soldier. The Nazis are almost close, 300 meters. The soldiers are ready to shoot, but there is no signal. The distance between the Nazis and the platoon was shrinking by the minute. "With permission, comrade commander," whispers the machine gunner. "Easy, Ivan Vasilievich. Just a little more." Kazantsev's dense figure merged with the machine gun, his fingers on the trigger. It seemed to him that he could hear the melted water squelching under the Hitlerites' feet, the mud slurping. "Nay, fire," commanded the lieutenant. A long line of Kazantsev's machine guns sounded together with the command, like a signal. Automatic rifles struck. Their shots merged with the fractional clatter of hand and machine guns. Hitlerites rushed from side to side, but they were mowed down by the fire. They lay low, then crawled back to the gully. The first attack was repulsed. Machine guns were still firing, mines and shells were bursting, and the soldiers of the supply platoon of the rifle battalion with their commander Kalugin crawled to the front line. Soon the kettles were tinkling, spoons were clattering, the dispenser was deftly wielding a leg. The fragrant steam of borscht was wafting over the thermoses. And people ate hurriedly. The enemy could resume the attack, and he really did not make himself long to wait. The kettles were not empty yet, and the Nazis had already poured gunfire on the defense of the division. After the artillery preparation, the enemy infantry, this time supported by tanks, went on the offensive. The Nazis furiously rushed forward. The ground shook from the bursts of shells. Clearly acted our artillerymen. From the fire of the division of Captain Alexander Belov, one of the enemy tanks caught fire, not reaching the front edge of the defense of the rifle battalion of Captain Grigory Pokotov. Another was hit by the battery of Captain Nikolai Kuf. The third went up in smoke in front of the defense of the anti-tank gun platoon of Lieutenant Alexei Naumov. But tanks and machine gunners, firing frantically at our positions, were approaching the front line of the defense of the rifle battalions. The trenches began to get the fire of fascist machine gunners. Several tanks, firing on the move from short stops, approached the line of trenches of the rifle company of Senior Lieutenant Volkov, keeping up with the tanks, with automatic rifles in their bellies and firing indiscriminately. The riflemen followed them. Machine guns of the company of the former electrician of Revdada Metallurgical Plant Konstantin Kresnov poured lead rain on the enemy machine gunners, cutting them off from the tank. The enemy infantry lay down, but the tanks passed over the trenches of Volkov's soldiers. Some young Red Army soldiers from the replenishment, unable to overcome fear, jumped out of the trenches and rushed back. They were mowed down by the fire of enemy tank machine guns. But from the cells of experienced soldiers, they were in the company, most of them, flew grenades and bottles with a flammable mixture. One tank caught fire, another spun on the spot with a blown track. Peter Shuprov, the company commander, clutched anti-tank grenades in both hands and climbed out of his trench. Under the whistle of bullets and bursting shells, he quickly crawled to the tank, which went straight at Kazantsev's machine gun. He found a convenient place for a throw, raised himself up and threw 2 grenades one after the other, and then something strongly burned the part of his shoulder. The tank stopped. A huge column of smoke burst out of it, but the last enemy's turn wounded Kazantsev. His machine gun was silenced. The fascists rose in height. They ran straight at the machine gun, believing that success is assured. "Oh, you say," cursed Shuprov. His shoulder was burning. The slightest movement caused sharp pain, and Kazantsev's machine gun continued to remain silent. Gathering all his strength, the Parto crawled to him. The fascists were already 60-70 meters away from the machine gun when Shuprov gave a turn. He hit aptly. Hitlerites were falling down. Not far from him, strong swings through one after another Limenka and hit from a machine gun Shuprov's friend Sergeant Arkady Konashinsky. Deputy commander of the machine gun company, Lieutenant Pavel Zolotukin, replacing a wounded machine gunner, was continuously shooting from a machine gun. At the most intense moment on the right flank spoke machine gun brothers Rusev. The grey-green mass scattered across the gully. The Hitlerites were rising and lying down, but they did not go forward. They were pressed to the ground by machine guns and automatic rifles. In the thick of the enemy mines sent by the mortars of Anatoly Zaitev's platoon were continuously bursting. A multi-voiced hurrah rang out from the right. It was Grigory Pokotayev's battalion that went into the counterattack. The fascists could not withstand the blow, shooting back, began to retreat. Until the evening of March 19, machine gun and machine gun fire rattled, shells and mines burst, tank engines roared. But all attempts of the enemy to break through the defense of the division failed. The fascists suffered great damage and withdrew to Belgorod. This victory was not easy for us. Many were missed by the command. Night fell on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Frolov, commander of the 1,243rd Infantry Regiment, reported to the division commander that the enemy had been stopped. On the battlefield there were 5 tanks and more than 200 enemy corpses. Vasily Maximovich ordered the Chief of Staff to draw up a scheme for the circular defense of the regiment. So in the foggy haze in March 1943, the first morning for the Ural Division was born on the southern phase of the so-called Kursk Bulge. Underground city. Here is May, the month of wonderful blossoming of the earth. The thick leaves of trees rustle quietly and tenderly. The rays of the bright sun warm the earth. From the meadow behind the farm Yerrik, the wind brings the smell of green grass and wildflowers. Somewhere the trills of a lark are ringing merrily. Everything is filled with thirst for life. But the spring breath of nature, its calmness did not dispel the anxiety in the soul of combat Pokotayev. In this established silence at the front, even the buzzer of the telephone seems to be a siren's roar. Combat in turn talked to the company commanders. Everything was in order, created anti-tank and anti-personnel defense, people, machine guns, cannons, kitchens and wagons, all of it sunk into the ground, all disappeared from view. But it looked like that only on the surface, and in the ground there was life, there was preparing a crushing blow to the hated enemy. Day and night, people were digging trenches with rifle cells, anti-tank ditches, escarpments, pulling wire fences, putting minefields. Every day the underground city with its bunkers, dugouts connected with each other by communication lines was expanding. As if the commander had nothing to worry about, but he was overcome by anxiety for the junction with his right neighbour, with a battalion of Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Pavlovich Ignatenko, who was defending the boundary line between our and the 52nd Guards Rifle Division. Pokotayev was well aware of the enemy's tactics, to strike at the joints. Although Grigory Ivanovich put their guns, a platoon of machine guns, more than 100 anti-tank, anti-personnel mines, and there was an anti-tank ditch, wire in 2 stakes. But if the enemy has tanks with mine countermeasure equipment, a sufficient number of sappers to neutralize mines and make passages in the wire fence is not so difficult. Defended by the battalion site, the highway is very important. She sought the captain, and the enemy will not leave it alone. In his thoughts, the commander one after another scrolled options for the actions of his battalion in the event of an enemy strike at the junction, but they all led him to one decision: to ask the regimental commander to ensure the junction of one more battery. So Pokotayev's battalion was to prevent the breakthrough of tanks and infantry along the highway Belgorod, Oboyan, and in cooperation with other battalions of the regiment and with supporting units to destroy infantry and tanks on the approaches to the defence. Combat put on a helmet, checked his gun, came out of the dugout and quickly went to the front of the battalion's defence. He gave orders on the move, in 2 or 3 words explained what to what. Everyone understood him, as they say, with half a word. A narrow winding, like the crooked streets of the old Belgorod, camouflaged from above, led the commander to a breach built on the slope of an unnamed height north of the farm Yerrik for dagger and flanking fire. From the embrasures of the breach, well viewed ahead of the terrain along the highway Belgorod, Combat approached the embrasure and carefully, through the sight of the machine gun, looked first directly, then to the left and right. There, not once seen and re-seen for 2 months of defence in this area highway, a barn by the road, a bright green young grove behind the rift there, the battalion's combat guard. All round is silent, only a bird flies up not far from there. The captain was thinking. In his memory revived summer days spent together with his wife on the eve of the war. They wandered through the same flower-strewn fields, listened to the birds singing, made plans for the future, waiting for their firstborn. So much for the birds, he said aloud. What, Comrade Combat? Asked the surprised machine gunner. Nothing. I'm so... The captain cut short the memories and, turning to the machine gunners, said, Now you can clearly see not only the highway and Yerrik, but even Zagotskot, and then completely overgrown with weeds. We had the weeds, Comrade Captain, for camouflage. You, said the commander of the machine gun crew Leonov. Setikayev smiled, satisfied with the clever sergeant. He checked how the calculation knows the landmarks, asked about the organization of interchangeability, the availability of individual bags, ammunition stock. Then he asked if they were satisfied with the quality of food, if they received letters from home, if they received newspapers daily. Keep your eyes open. Hitlerites are about to go on the offensive. Be ready to meet them. Don't worry, Comrade Combat. The fascists won't pass through here. We'll die, but we won't let them pass through our defense, he assured Sergeant Leonoff. Why die? They are waiting for us at home. We must not let the enemy through alive. The machine gun works well in the hands of a brave man. Of course it does, he agreed the sergeant. Maybe they will start the offensive as they were going to on May 10, asked machine gunner Ivanov. Anything is possible. We always have to be on guard. The fascists will still go on the offensive, that's for sure. Not for the parade they pull up here, large tank and infantry forces. Comrade Combat, why don't we go on the offensive? Apparently the time hasn't come. We must first beat them up, bleed them out in a defensive battle, and then finish them off in an offensive battle. So we're preparing defenses for the offensive, the machine gunner asked. Such a question arose not only among soldiers but also among us officers, although we guessed to some extent why, having such large forces in the area, went to a solid defence, but we did not know the plan of the Supreme Command headquarters. The battles would be heavy. The enemy forces were great. It is necessary to prepare for a difficult struggle. Our guns and tanks, of course, the main force in the fight against enemy tanks, but in battle under the blow of fascist Makinov can fall to any warrior. Here's what said the commander. Well memorized the vulnerable places of the Tiger. He pulled out of his pocket divisional newspaper in defense of the motherland, where the tank was drawn with an indication of where it is better to hit, and handed it to the machine gunners. Soon the captain, having said goodbye to the soldiers, went to the artilleryman. After Polkatayev's departure, the soldiers talked about the commander. That's the commander, the soul of a man. With such a man you won't be lost. Nothing is scary with him. I know him from the battles near Moscow, said the sergeant. He has a kind soul. His kindness is strict. He doesn't let anyone down, Otkin put in. His soul is kind, but his hand is firm. Leonov added after a little silence. We can't do otherwise. We need to deepen the trench a little more and increase the foxhole. Interrupted the conversation senior sergeant. The captain visited Lieutenant Gusev's platoon, the artillery positions of the battery of Senior Lieutenant Nikolaev and Captain Kovtun. Again and again he meticulously checked the readiness of people to repel enemy attacks. He advised commanders how to better combine work on improving defensive structures with training of personnel. Again and again told the soldiers how to better fight the Tigers. We know how to beat light and medium tanks, but what if the Tigers and Panthers come at us? Asked the commander. Former warrior Kudaibaderev, who had too set fire to the tanks, jokingly replied. They will burn longer than the average ones. Everyone laughed. Combat's conversation was interrupted by the growing rumble of a crutch, a fascist reconnaissance plane that appeared at high altitude. It's a cursed one, Lieutenant Putintsev, the commander of the anti-tank gun platoon, said angrily. It flies several times a day. He's sniffing around. Rifle shots rattled here and there. Anti-tank guns slammed sharply. Somewhere not far away anti-aircraft guns often beat. Now wait, a flock of musicians would soon fly by. From the side of Yakshniva Kolodizha, now and then began to be heard gunshots of the enemy. Shells were bursting near the village of Belomsnaya on the defense of the 1241st Rifle Regiment. The fascists are plotting something, yes, said the commander and gave the command. To places, and he quickly went to his observation post. Before the decisive battles, during the period of preparation for the decisive battles at the Kursk Bulge, the Central Committee of our party adopted a number of decisions to improve the structure of the political apparatus, party and Komsomol organizations in the Red Army. Three decisions basically boiled down to the following. The post of deputy commander of the unit on political part was merged with the post of chief of the political department. Deputy commanders of companies and batteries on political part were abolished. The institute of appointed party and Komsomol leaders in companies, battalions and regiments was introduced. Primary party and Komsomol organizations in battalions and divisions were created. The regimental bureau was equated in rights to the party committee. From the first days of its existence, the new structure showed that it was more flexible and responsive in solving the problems facing the Red Army at that time. As a result of the restructuring in our division formed 82 primary party and Komsomol organizations, and the number of company and their equal organizations before the start of the fighting reached 195. The work of company and battery organizations was noticeably intensified. Communists and Komsomol members felt more responsibility for the condition of their units and units. They provided great assistance to commanders in solving combat problems. Widely unfolded after the reorganization of party political work in the division, contributed to increasing the firmness of units and subdivisions in the defense. Practice has confirmed the reasonableness of the new structure. Looking ahead, I will give one example out of hundreds. In 5 days during the fighting for Belgorod in the 1,241st Rifle Regiment was accepted into the party 84 people, in the 932nd Artillery Regiment, 78, almost the same number. Was it possible under the old structure during an offensive battle to consider such a number of applications for admission to the party? Of course not. The new structure allowed to quickly replace the retired party leaders and Komsorg. The work was uninterrupted. Before the storm, a calm dawn was slowly breaking on the Kursk Bulge. A huge fireball of the sun slowly floated out. Around reigned a silence unusual for the front. Even the leaves of trees did not ripple. Their machine gunners, riflemen Patarovsky, froze in their fighting positions. Artillerymen and mortarmen waited only for the command fire, all prepared to meet the enemy, not for a second without leaving their observation posts, without taking their binoculars from their eyes. The commanders of all ranks were intensely looking in the direction of the enemy. "Ah, what a rare good morning today," said Sergeant Shipman. "Yes, it's just grace." Silence as if the war was over. "Me," supported him Soldier Borisov. From this position well viewed our front line, the heights going to Belgorod, on which slightly visible twisted threads of the enemy's communication lines. Bright morning rays of the sun, as if specially for us, illuminated the enemy positions, so that they were well seen by our observers. The sergeant, scrutinizing the enemy's positioning, said, "Are the Hitlerites extinct or what? No sign of life." But every morning at this time, exactly according to the schedule, they opened fire. The second day they are silent. "They are putting our vigilance to sleep, Comrade Sergeant." "You think they're cheating?" "That's right. What else is there? We're not shoddy either. It's hard to be cunning with a cunning one." The sun was rising higher and higher. It was the hot 4th day of July. Hour after hour passed, and there was still a serene silence around. Such silence that one could hear the grass rustling in the wind. Even our radio operators, who listened to the silent air until their ears ached, could hear nothing suspicious. But the silence was deceptive. We knew very well that the enemy, like a predator, lurked for a that Hitler's troops will go on the offensive July 3-6. We were warned by the headquarters of the 6th Guards Army on the night of July 3. Later we learned that the higher command knew almost exactly what forces, means and where the Nazis would strike. Based on this, the retaliatory strikes against the advancing enemy troops were thought out in detail and prepared. In addition to what we already knew about the enemy and his plans, valuable information was obtained from a sergeant of the reconnaissance detachment of the 168th Infantry Division of the Germans, who defected to us at dawn on July 4. The defector revealed that the Hitlerite offensive would begin from July 4 to July 5. "Now that I have definitely learned about the impending offensive of the German army," said the defector, "I decided that this is a convenient time to warn the Red Army, and thus prove that I am sincere. I wanted to cross even earlier, but crossing at a different time would have aroused suspicion against me." At night, from July 2 to July 3, Mosintinid the defector, sappers of the SS Panzer Division, dead-haired all night long cleared minefields. Infantry units, cannons and 6-barrel mortars arriving from Kharkov were unloaded in Belgorod. The testimony of the defector once again confirmed the already known day of the Hitlerites' offensive. The sergeant, without taking his eyes off, kept looking forward. From tension rippled in his eyes, time dragged languidly. From our advanced positions, long ago having already fed lunch to the personnel, the last camp kitchens left, and the time was approaching 16 o'clock. Rare clouds, throwing shadows on the ground, floated to the west. Nothing and no one disturbed silence still constrained the entire rugged, densely filled with people and military equipment defense strip of the division, from Ranushaya to Chernaya Polyana. Suddenly the sergeant's ear caught the muffled, increasing rumble of engines from the direction of Belgorod. Shishkin, alert, listened. Although neither in the air nor on the ground nothing was visible, but Alexei, with all his being felt, realized enemy planes are coming. He brought binoculars to his eyes. Wanted to make sure, but it was no longer necessary. Alarming signals air, coming from the forward observation posts, swept through the trenches and artillery firing positions. Air, commanded the sergeant and his squad. The planes were not yet visible, but by the hum of the engines, the experienced soldiers determined that this is not a crutch, not a separate group of planes, but something new, hitherto unprecedented. It's starting, Comrade Sergeant. Do not get distracted, cut off the observer Shushkin and commanded. Settlement, to cover. Oh, motherfucker, how many of them? Now 10, 20, counted the soldiers. And there's another pack, more than 30 approaching Yakontov. He added another, and on the horizon appeared many more black dots, the second wave of airplanes, such a number of enemy planes, simultaneously going to bombing, the sergeant has never seen. These black swarms, as if their swastika wings wanted to cover the sun. They came in 2 tiers. At the top, like kites, circled a few dozen messers. A little lower, with a heavy bomb load, went Junkers. Friendly opened fire, our anti-aircraft guns. The sky was stained with white caps of bursts. Our fighters rushed to meet the enemy planes. There was a fierce air battle. Front Junkers, not reaching the main strip of our defence, tilted, turned to the right and sharply went down. Behind him, roaring engines, stretched out in a chain, tailing each other, other planes and lined up in a circle. It was a familiar Hitlerite formation for bombing. What is our slow? Anxiously said the sergeant. Now they will drop bombs. So the same fighter who counted the planes, seeing that one bomber, not having time to stand in a circle, thickly smoked and began to fall, shouted loud. Whoa, that's it. Pressed against the wall of the trench. The fighters looked up, trying to see the air battle, and determined where the bombers would go to strike. Several of our fighters broke through the barrier of messers to the Junkers. Bomber, which was in the centre of the circle, flashed and went down, soon smoke another, but the others went into a dive and began dropping bombs on the positions of our combat guard. Captain Pokatayev tensely watched the head bomber rapidly going into a dive. Pillars of earth flew up, raised by the explosions of bombs. The lead Junkers followed the others. Soon the position of the battalion's combat guard, south of the farm Yerrik, sunk in thick dust and smoke. Communication with the combat guard was cut off. Pokatayev, in the general rumble of barely perceptible signs, tried to determine what losses are now the combat guard. She and Butt knew well that the trench and narrow slots with niches reliably shelter soldiers from shrapnel, and the probability of a direct hit in a narrow slot is not so great. But when he looked at the continuously falling bombs on a small section of the defence, his heart was torn by the thought. Is it all? He tried to push this thought away from him, but it returned again with each new approach of enemy bombers. Combat almost physically felt the falling bombs, but he was powerless to help the soldiers of the combat guard. In front of the captain was not the enemy, which he could destroy with bayonet and grenade, as he did at Rushev when the rifle platoon of his company was surrounded. Seen Grigory Ivanovich, then with a group of fighters rushed to the rescue. In hand-to-hand combat his group destroyed the enemy, helped the soldiers in a difficult situation. The enemy planes had not yet disappeared over the horizon, as the enemy artillery and mortars opened heavy fire. Once again explosions began to shred the ground, but the smoke and dust was now less than during the bombing. Combat could see the position of the combat guard, the right and left flanks of his battalion. Recently green, studded with flowers field, was now black. Division Commander Govorunenko, from his forward observation post, clearly saw how under cover of artillery fire went enemy tanks. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Azarov to give barrage fire on the path of the tanks. He himself focused on the operational map, spread out in front of him. The commander tried to anticipate the route of the tanks, to determine where they will strike. Soon over the dugout commander howled shells flew with howling. Smoke and fire enveloped the Nazi tanks. Lieutenant Gusev, who was watching the advance of the tanks, lost sight of them for a while. But soon the tanks broke through the barrage and went straight to the positions of the combat guard. These long-barreled hulks were coming slowly, but it seemed to the lieutenant that they were coming at an incredible speed. Their shells, launched from short stops, raised the ground ahead and behind the trench where the lieutenant was. Andrei Gusev tried to determine how much time would pass until the tanks would approach his trench. But then from behind the hillock, to the right of the highway, appeared several more tanks with a troop of machine gunners. At the thought that all this avalanche of tanks in a few minutes will be here, in the chest of the lieutenant, for a moment moved a sense of fear. Won't they crush everyone? He was getting more and more lost. Uncertainty took hold of him. What to do? What command to give? Andrei did not find the right words, the right decision. He turned. If the artilleryman's senior lieutenant Alexander Sirkin, for whom now, except for the tanks coming at them, nothing existed, looked at the lieutenant, he would immediately notice how a small shiver beats his shoulders. Gusev quickly came to his senses. Good commander, he reproached himself like a hare trembling. Ashamed of a momentary weakness, he furtively glanced at Senior Lieutenant Sirkin and, making sure that he did not pay attention to him, a little calmed down. Trying to suppress the trembling in his body, the lieutenant tensely, hopefully looked at the narrow strip of land ahead of the position of the combat guard. Only if they exploded, if they worked, he whispered to himself. Suddenly the lieutenant remembered that he had not yet given a command to the combat guard. Grenades, bottles, to battle, he shouted with all his might. His voice was breaking. Drops of sweat ran down his face. The loud voice and the thought that the right solution had been found gave Gusev back his confidence. When there were a few hundred meters to the guard, the tanks sharply increased speed. Junior Sergeant Andrei Trigubeau, seeing in the embrasure, as the tanks with the troops crawled out of the ravine, exclaimed, "Here they are, the damned." He dug his shoulder into the stock of the machine gun and pulled the trigger. A long line, like a strong wind, blew off the front tank of the machine gunners. Tregubov took aim and fired at the second group of paratroopers. Not far from Tregubov shook the machine gun of Junior Sergeant Kazantsev, who had recently returned from the hospital. Tanks, reaching the minefield with a move, ran into the mines. From under the tracks of the front burst out flames. Other vehicles, as if on command, slowed down at once. Only this was waiting for Senior Lieutenant Sirkin. He shouted into the telephone receiver. Fire. One, then another. Then a third camouflaged direct-fire cannon struck. Immediately 2 fires broke out, and then another. Zebras in green-brown camouflage coats scattered on the charred ground. They were mowed down by the fire of our machine guns. Not daring to go forward without tanks, they lay down in front of the minefield. The armoured fighters of Lieutenant Alexei Naumov's platoon hurriedly hit the tank. "Comrade Captain, the combat guard is on the wire," the excited voice shouted telephonist. Without looking, Pokateyev stretched out his hand and quickly picked up the phone. "Why didn't you say anything?" A direct hit on the line. Lieutenant Gusev hastily spoke at the other end of the wire. "They are attacking 10 tanks with a troop of machine gunners. Support them with fire." "I see. We'll support them. Hold on tight. Don't think of retreating unless it's necessary. Stay alive, my dear." The calm, friendly voice of the commander added to the lieutenant's confidence. "German Yakovlevich, my friend, help Gusev out. Combat again nestled to the stereo tube." "On the Nazi tanks. Fugitive," Mezzi shouted into the tube division commander Malshakov. Shells were bursting between the tanks. One tank began to spin on the spot. A shell hit the caterpillar. Another one burst into flames and black smoke billowed in the wind. "Good," approved the commander of the artillerymen. In his black shining eyes appeared sparks of joy. "Well done. So it is necessary." Enemy artillery fiercely hit the combat guard. Tanks were also fiercely firing. There were wounded and the first number of machine gun Andrei Petrovich Tregubov was wounded in the leg, but he did not leave the battlefield. After bandaging, continued to hit the fascists who were crawling to the trench of the combat guard. At this critical moment of the battle, the machine gun, which was beating just to the right of Lieutenant Gusev, fell silent. "What happened? Why are you not firing?" shouted the lieutenant. Then rushed over there. The machine gunner's head ducked into the ground, a trickle of blood from his forehead. Gusev quickly lay down behind the machine gun, himself opened fire on the approaching fascists. Hitlerites could not withstand, lay down. Then Gusev handed the machine gun to his orderly, and himself, going from fighter to fighter in the trench, loudly gave commands so that his subordinates could see and hear him. The lieutenant well understood that the presence of the commander in battle among the soldiers always gives more confidence, their strength as if doubled. "Well, brothers, hold on. Well done." He cheered up the soldiers, firing a machine gun at the Nazis. Many wounded men, seeing their commander nearby, overcoming the pain, took up automatic rifles and began to hit the advancing enemy. Tanks came very close. firing from cannons and machine guns. They were approaching the trenches of the combat guard. Lieutenant Gusev looked behind the bumper, and his heart sank. The tank went straight to the trench. Behind him, firing machine guns, ran Hitlerites. The tank and the Nazis seemed invulnerable, as if enchanted. They passed through the bursts of shells, and the lieutenant, having applied to the machine gun, one after another gave some cues on the enemy. The tank kept moving forward. Gusev ordered the machine gunner to shoot at the tank's observation slip. "Grenades to the battle," loudly commanded the lieutenant. Someone threw a grenade. It fell before reaching the tank. "Now, don't hurry. Don't throw grenades for nothing," shouted Gusev. He took 2 anti-tank grenades, lurked, then threw them, flying dozens more grenades thrown by soldiers. From the right flank, several anti-tank guns were hitting the tank. Suddenly, the tank turned sharply and began to spin in place. "It while he is spinning," shouted Gusev. A bottle of flammable liquid thrown by Kazantsev set it on fire. Other tanks, unable to overcome the minefield and the fire of our artillery, shooting back, slowly crawled back. The German attack was smothered. In front of Pokotayev's battalion guard position, 2 tanks, with swastikas on their turrets, were smouldering. One of them was standing on the minefield with its gun down. A fire was also burning near the trench. Here and there lay the corpses of fascist soldiers. Colonel Goforenko, with a blue pencil, made notes on the map, clarified the details of the battle. Military experience had taught the colonel that in such conditions one should not hurry, make hasty conclusions. He tried to catch the main thing in the enemy's actions by the smallest signs of battle, to make the right decision, and to respond to the enemy's blow with a double blow. "You assume that the Germans are pulling up the main forces to the original positions for the attack?" asked Lieutenant Colonel Azarov. "And what does the god of war thinks?" The commander answered the question with a question. A telephone buzzer interrupted the conversation. The commander picked up the phone. Reported the regiment commander Frollo. "The attack has not yet resumed, but you can hear the noise of engines." At this time, in the dugout, entered the Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel Loshko. "What's new, Konstantin Mikhailovich? How are things at the right neighbor?" addressed him commander. Tanks and infantry attacked the combat guard of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, but without success. "Stop the attacks," reported the Chief of Staff. "But on the site of the 67th Guards Rifle Division, the matter is worse. Hitlerites knocked down the combat guard, came close to the front edge of the division's defense. Now they are engaged in a firefight. At our left neighbor, so far all is calm. Officers of the political department were gathered. Instructor Akhmedzianov told some funny story. Everyone pretended to be fascinated by Muhammad Akhmedyanovic's story. In fact, it was only an attempt to hide their excitement behind a funny story. They were now thinking about something else, about the upcoming battle. After all, not only the officers of the political department, but every soldier knew that the enemy had concentrated a huge force against us. It was known that only in the area of Belgorod the enemy has 1 motorized, about 10 tank and 7 infantry divisions. Directly against us were the Tank Division Deadhead and the 168th Infantry Division, just west of them. Adolf Hitler. These SS divisions were formed from the most egregious thugs and armed with the best equipment available in the Nazi army. Hitler threw them always on the main directions. At dawn we were to meet them, therefore the excitement of the officers of the political department was natural, and no matter how hard they tried to hide it, it did not quite succeed. I knew each of them very well. After all, they were not just my subordinates, but my closest friends and comrades. This friendship was not once tested during the years of war in battles and cemented by blood. Of course, they are worried. How can not worry? Today, for some 3 or 4 hours of battle, the division lost more than 50 people. At the table, Vasily Fedorovich Oparin, executive secretary of the divisional party committee. He is old enough to be many people's fathers. He is now preparing cases on admission to the party for the meeting, which was to be held in the rifle battalion of the 45th Regiment. On the large face of the secretary, with light, slightly tired eyes, almost no reflection of the cheerful story Akhmedyanov. During the years of war, almost all meetings of the party commission, Vasily Fedorovich spent almost all the meetings of the party commission on the front lines, in a trench, a dugout, or even just in the trench. At these meetings were discussed about 9,000 applications. Sometimes, when he presented for approval the decision of the party committee on admission to the party, He spoke passionately about the exploits of each of the entrants. Next to Oparin sat propaganda instructor, tall, broad-shouldered, a slouch in the shoulders with large facial features, Nikolai Alexeyevich Kotov. This is an unhurried and calculating in his movements fearless man. Being a propagandist of the 1,241st Regiment, he together with soldiers participated in liberation of villages of the Kalinin region from occupants, was always there, where it was more difficult, where it was more dangerous, taking the soldiers with him. In one of the battles near Rizhev, Kotov was wounded, but he did not leave the division. He was cured in a medical unit, and he was appointed an instructor of political department of the division. Nikolai Alexeyevich, listening to the storyteller, tried to make the story more funny with his lines. Isaac Markovich Rabinovich, a small stature, round-faced, a blob of energy himself, an instructor on work among the troops and population of the enemy, listening to Akhmedzianov's story, laughed merrily. Today he had a free day. There was no transfer for enemy soldiers, but he was ready to go to the front line at least now. Sekno Pavel Faith-Enrich Klymanov, the instructor on the accounting of party and Komsomol documents, was not wasting time. He was filling in party tickets, which he and I were to hand out tonight in the rifle battalions of the 43rd Regiment. Stefan Nikolaevich Bekarev, the editor of the divisional newspaper in defense of the motherland, before giving me to look at, once again read the just-typed leaflet about the exploits of the heroes of today's battle. The newspaper staff had already had time to visit the front line. There was no time to confer long. Before the beginning of our artillery counterattack, we had to be in the units. We quickly agreed what should be done in the units who would go to which regiment, and barely had time to reach the front line, as at the positions of artillery units supporting our division, dozens of rockets flew up, and immediately the ground trembled, opened a quick fire on the enemy more than 100 guns and installations of the Guards' mortars, participating in the General Army counter-preparation. On the enemy positions, in the area of Belgorod, raged a tornado of fire. What a force! It's a pity it's not enough, only 5 minutes. Someone said, "That's all right. There will be more." That's a reinforcement of our words. We tell a fighter that we're not alone, we have a force behind us, but he doesn't see it. Now you can see, rejoicing, added Dmitry Alexeyevich Petrovsky, the agitator of the... In his memoirs, the commander of our army, General Imchistyakov, notes, "I believe that our artillery counter-preparation gave a good result, as inhabitants of Tomarivka told us later. Hitlerites were carrying wounded and killed all night." We once again checked the readiness of units for the upcoming battle, whether everything was done, whether everything was in its place. We talked to soldiers, commanders, spent the whole night in trenches, in combat guards, talked to communists and Komsomol members. Everyone was waiting for an enemy attack, but we did not notice any despondency in anyone. Just people were ready for battle. In the 4th Rifle Company Petrovsky and I caught the end of the conversation, which was held with the Soldiers' Company Commander Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Antonovich Volkov. Our task, not to miss the enemy, to come together with him chest to chest. Stop, exhaust his forces, bleed and destroy in front of the front line of defense. Pater Chuprov added, "Maybe death awaits us, but the Nazis through the defense of our company will not pass." And in other units observed the same picture. The soldiers did not sleep. How can you sleep before such a battle, which was expected? Everyone wants to talk to each other, to write letters to relatives and friends, maybe for the last time. We saw the same thing in the dugout of Lieutenant Pogorilov's Komsomol platoon. By the lamp made of a shell casing, the soldiers were writing letters. Some of them were talking in a low voice. After our conversation with those who were in the dugout, Platoon Commander Pogorilov approached a member of the party bureau of the regiment, Captain Petrovsky, and handed him several sheets of paper folded in half. "What is this, Pavel Alexandrovich?" asked the captain. "An application with a request to accept me into the ranks of the Bolshevik Party, an autobiography and recommendations." "All right, as soon as I return, I'll give it to the secretary of the party bureau of the regiment." The captain opened his bag, put there the application, where already lay 15 handed to him for tonight. "Please accept me into the party. I want to go into battle as a communist." These words to me, the head of the political department of the division, were very close. They were written daily by soldiers, wishing to link their fate with the party forever, to give their heart and all of themselves to the party of Lenin. Many times we had to read them on crumpled, sometimes blood-soaked scraps of paper taken from the pockets of soldiers who had fallen in battle. It was not always possible to gather the communists in time to consider the submitted applications, and sometimes they did not have time to finish a meeting or a bureau session. The enemy suddenly attacked the unit. Then the communists, having interrupted the meeting, rushed into battle. There were times when the one whose statement was discussed was killed in battle. So it happened to Lieutenant Pogorelov. At dawn began a heavy battle, and by the end of the day was no longer among us. Komsomol Pogorelov fell in battle, died a death of the brave. Considering the application without him, the party bureau of the regiment wrote in the resolution to consider Lieutenant Komsomol Pavel Alexandrovich Pogorelov a communist, as he selflessly, as a communist, fought with the enemy in battle. During the years of war, more than 10,000 applications, with the words, "Please accept me into the party," were submitted to the party organizations of units and subdivisions of our division. Warriors wanted to carry a party ticket heart in battle. About 40 years have passed since the last salvos of the great patriotic war thundered, but I still remember the words I read then in the front newspaper. Always go forward in battle open. We swore to fight to the end. Above the bullet-riddled party card, that was in the battle on the soldier's heart. That night long smoked wicks in shell casings in the dugouts of soldiers of the front line. Winding deep trench led us to the positions of the company, which was commanded by Viktor Ivanovich Carter. In the circle of soldiers stood Assistant Chief of Political Department for Komsomol work Captain Andrianov, and handed Komsomol tickets to those who were accepted today in the Komsomol. Congratulations with each of them. Say congratulations on receiving a Komsomol ticket. I hope that in battle you will justify the high rank of a member of the Lenin Komsomol. I'll justify my trust, comrade captain. Followed the answers. Mikhail Flegontovich Andrianov, before the war the first secretary of the Nizhny Tagil City Komsomol Committee, with the beginning of the war came to the Ural Division, and he was elected the secretary of the Bureau of the Komsomol Organization of the 1245th Rifle Regiment. From the first day of the regiment's combat operations, Mikhail was always there where the Komsomol light was. When the commander of a rifle company was seriously wounded, and there was no one to replace him, he took command. Soon Michael was also wounded, but he did not leave before the end of the battle, continued to command the company. He went to the infirmary only when a new company commander was appointed. In June of the 42nd year, after Peter Alexandrovich Repiev, the assistant to the chief of political department of the division on Komsomol work, left the division due to illness, Mikhail Andrianov was appointed instead of him. He was not much in the political department, and was more in the units, among the soldiers, in the trenches. Mikhail taught Komsogov regiments, battalions, companies, how to better help commanders to prepare the personnel for battle, helped organize the reception of young soldiers in the ranks of the Lenin Komsomol. There he filled out membership cards, handed them to the newly accepted right in the trenches of the front line or combat guard. Misha suffered severely when the instructor of the political department on the accounting of party and Komsomol tickets, Captain Pavel Klimanov, showed him the Komsomol ticket with the mark "killed," which had been recently punctured by a bullet and stained with blood, returned to the political department. And returning from the area of the farm Yerik, we went to the company of machine gunners, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Pavel Georgievich Zolotokin. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Except for the sentries and duty officers, everyone was asleep. Some in the dugout, some hugging a machine gun at the dugout. Pyotr Kritanin, my orderly, smiled, pointing at the sleeping men, said, "Sleeping like the Shapayevs?" It was still fresh in all of our memories. Just watch the movie Chapapiv, shown by the club political department in all units of the division. Peter's line and the sight of sleeping soldiers reminded me of the episode described by Fermanov in the book Chapayev. Before dawn, I returned to the observation post of the division commander. The commander and the task force of the division headquarters were already there. Pyotr Dmitrievich, standing at his camp table, talking on the phone. From his answers, it was clear that at the other end of the wire, Commander General Shistyakov. Putting down the phone, the commander said, "The division and this confident. The division and this time will show its Ural character, will stand firmly on the occupied boundary." The general warned that the repeated counter-preparation would begin soon. Combat Pokotayev once again went around the line of defense of the battalion. As a good master inspects his house, expecting inclement weather, so he checked the readiness of the line and people for all the twists and turns, the hills, all the trenches and trenches, the highway and the guns dug into the ground around it, the tanks of the 96th Tank Brigade, holes and even some bushes. Everything was well known to him. He returned to his observation post, did not go to the command post. There was silence, only from the direction of Belgorod. There was a barely perceptible murmur of tank air. "I'm going to lie down for a while," he said to his orderly. "You, if I fall asleep, wake me up in an hour." Having unbuttoned the collar of his uniform and relaxed his belt, the captain lay down on the overcoat spread out by the orderly, but he could not fall asleep. Turning from side to side, he lit a match and looked at his watch. It was 10 minutes past 2. The captain got up. "Comrade Combat, you are asked by the regiment commander," said the telephonist, handing the telephone receiver to the captain. "What's new ahead?" Still quiet. "Combat patrol reports that heard talking and some metallic sounds. The engines have stopped running." "I see. It's probably the calm before the storm." Saying goodbye to the commander, Vasily Maximovich Frolov added, "Keep your eyes open."